Greetings from Chicago. I'm Todd Kelsey. I'm a professor at Benedictine University, and I'm just going to be giving this little video clip to start off and then going to the presentation. I've been researching AI as well as doing some research with the Glia Foundation, which I'll mention later in the presentation, but just wanted to say hello, and then I'll start the presentation now. So this presentation is called Surfing the AI Tsunami, and it is including a suggested way to pursue 3 stages, whether you're an individual or a school or corporation or a national government or local government. And it's just simply called Adapt, Adopt, and Adept. And the presentation is based on a book that I wrote with the same title and an introduction to artificial intelligence and options for responding. So a little bit about me. I have a background in emerging technology. I'm a professor at Benedictine University in the Chicago area, so that's halfway in between Silicon Valley and New York City, I guess. And I've always been interested in emerging technology, was aware of artificial intelligence, but then I just started looking more seriously at the impact as of about 2017, and I found I couldn't hold AI at arm's length anymore. So basically, I wrote the book Surfing the Tsunami in January of 2018 for my students and for the general public, and basically made all my business students read it. And we've had discussion in classes ever since. And the field of AI changes so fast. There are some general things that have happened in between now and then, but the themes in this presentation are probably the same, except in between January of 2018 and now, I definitely recognize the power of AI has grown in terms of computing power. And another thing I just wanted to say in the context of COVID is one thing I recognized in terms of the impact on the economy and just the effect of automation and how it might impact people and companies simply is that there can be unknown things that enter the equation. So I recognize that something in 2018, I recognized something could come along and accelerate the impact of automation. And I didn't know COVID was coming, but there's data and evidence that suggest that's exactly what happened, that in good and bad ways. In good ways, there's a lot of automation that helped society and supply chains and things keep going and has allowed for some things to be done without human intervention because humans have gotten the virus. But then it's also had an impact on jobs, and to a certain extent, it's increased and accelerated that transition. And then since I wrote the book, I've been progressively immersing in applied AI. So I guess I'd call that not the pure computer science standpoint, but because I have both a business and computer science background, I'm interested in use cases of AI. And then as it starts to trickle out, doing something like interdisciplinary pursuit. So in a college setting, that means not just computer science majors, but business majors. And now it's definitely getting into the point in the business world where the same thing applies, where it's not just necessarily the IT team, but where a company, organization, a government can develop more AI fluency. And as new use cases, new ways of applying AI come out, it's an important thing to be thinking about, even if you're not necessarily a machine learning engineer or AI creator. So I just want to start out basically by relating my own story. For me, I started looking at AI from the basis of marketing, and that's one of the central uses of AI and automation, where digital marketing already existed, and to a certain extent, any process in marketing that's digital can be automated. And if you are not familiar with automation, if you might be familiar with Excel, so that's the top logo there, where you might be in a spreadsheet and at the very basic level doing certain processes on numbers, maybe adding or performing some kind of formula. And there's this feature in in Excel called Mechrez. Same thing in Microsoft Word, it's been around for a long time, where you can basically save yourself a lot of time if you're doing routine work by recording certain actions and automating them. And I experienced that a long time ago, and that's very helpful. But what's happened is the sophistication of automation, not just physical like robots, but virtually, where you go beyond routine tasks and what's called robotic process automation is increasing the sophistication such a great deal that there have been situations where companies have used, for example, Ivy League grads to train a neural network in very sophisticated analysis, and then the neural network learns from that and that doesn't necessarily need human input to do the same level of automation. So things have changed. For me, I started to notice things in Google AdWords. That's one of the topics I teach in digital marketing. And that was kind of a trigger point where I sort of wondered, I was forced to ask, okay, if automation is coming to AdWords, what's the implications? And if deep learning, AI, machine learning is increasingly applied, at what point would humans no longer be needed? And another company that kind of came into play in my thinking was Optimizer, which is an optimization company. So in general, I'm not against AI. I'm a realist, which I'll discuss, but the data that I see, experts agree that there's going to be a lot of disruption in the job market. And my attitude about it is basically, I think we need to create as many jobs as possible, including from AI. So there are optimists, and they believe that in the same way that, last industrial revolutions or phases, in the same way that those technologies such as electricity, for example, came along, or other kinds of technology, and people thought it would take away jobs, and then it ended up creating more. People apply that ethic or that analysis, and they say past performance is indicative of future performance. But if you know the investment world at all, that's a specific warning in the opposite direction. Like, you can't necessarily assume that because this was the case in the past, it's different in the future. And one of the reasons why I'm in between optimism and alarmism is because I think that a lot of the automation in office tasks is occurring because a lot of those tasks are so digital that the automation and job replacement can happen so much faster because so much of work is virtual and digital. And again, I'd say in COVID, that's become even more the case. So it's just something to be aware of, regardless of your philosophical position. And then on the other end, from optimists, there are alarmists warning that the destruction of jobs by AI could be far higher than what people imagine. So I just happen to be kind of in the middle of those two. And I'd say the third option, which I invite you to consider, is being a realist, to become aware of how the trends may impact various sectors. No one can prove it, but I think the data says take it very seriously, and including marketing. That's a familiar concept to many people, so it can be a starting point for learning about it. And that's why I introduced it in my marketing classes, like AI and its impact. And then I recommend becoming more aware of things are headed and looking for signs of disruption that may affect the job market, or your company or sector or your government. So being a realist means you're not necessarily for or against, maybe using AI to the best you can, but also being aware of some of the implications. So this is just one example in one industry, and this is what got my attention because I was trying to answer these questions in the context of teaching digital marketing. So I think that this is what Eric Schmidt, Google CEO, was talking about when I worked there. And this is the CEO of Optimizer talking. He would talk about during our weekly TGIF meetings, which supposedly is a Friday meeting. He envisioned a world where the ad system was so smart that it would know how to grow any business. A company could write a blank check to Google knowing that they would see profitable growth. So this is Frederick Weiss, employee number 300 at Google, CEO of a company called Optimizer. And this article came up in 2017 based on searches for information about when AI might remove the need for human management of digital marketing campaigns. So I saw this quote, and it's just one quote, but it seems to me to represent the aims and the potential for Google or AdWords to go directly to, say, a business owner. And there's already some elements of that happening. It's deep into the weeds of digital marketing, but automation is increasing. So this, got my attention. And that's where it started. So I want to be an optimist, and I started looking, opposing viewpoints, different sources of information, data, and then again, Frederick, here's another quote, and I think this is more recently, so that was 2018, the earlier quote was 2017. So here he's saying, we've reached a tipping point where the impact of Moore's law, the doubling processing power every 18 months, is accelerating the frequency with which new capabilities are launched that can eventually displace the need for human PPC managers, and that would be pay-per-click ads. And then there's a link there. At the end, just as a note, you can connect with me on LinkedIn if anybody would like a copy of this presentation or PDF or anything, just let me know. But so what I'd say is that this is marketing specifically, but this kind of thing, I think that you could apply to basically any industry, whether it's virtual or physical, and chances are there's some kind of technology that's helping to, depending on how you word it, either augment or replace human input. And I think the optimists and idealists would say it's best as augmentation, but economic forces, for example, COVID can come along and it may accelerate the pressure on a C-level executive. If you look at the way business works, and especially if the C-level executive is rewarded by his additional bonuses to maximize profit, then if you're looking at replacing people with a virtual tool that can replace them versus, say, reskilling them and continuing to use them, it's a tough place to be in. So it's a challenge, and all I'm saying is be aware of it, depending on where you are on the spectrum. So I want to be an optimist, but to me, the data says different. There's a disagreement about how fast and when jobs will be lost, but most of the data I've seen tells me it's very unpredictable, and a lot of data points to significant job loss. And some sources do predict significant job gain, but estimates vary widely. And since the original time when I created this presentation, this is kind of a edited version. One interesting study that I came across, and again, you could reach out to me on LinkedIn, I could give it to you, it's not just speculation. It's very hard to find headcount reduction data on jobs. So companies are understandably not necessarily willing to speak freely and openly about how many employees they've let go and replaced with some technology. But there was a study that I did find which showed across industries that more than half, and this may have been a year ago, it's a consulting company, and they did some research, and it was data that said that a significant amount of jobs already were being replaced and would be replaced. So this is not just speculation or alarmism. To me, there's some data that says that. And as I try to be an optimist, part of the reason I'm doing this presentation is to convince people to try and make money from AI and do everything you can to create companies and create new jobs, because it's not going to happen automatically. So here's some more evidence. Case in point, Kai-Fu Lee, very interesting person. He is kind of like a Bill Gates in China and has visibility. He spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and he's very blunt about this. So he's very deeply involved in both America and Chinese AI technology, an investor in many companies. You can look him up on LinkedIn. He has some very interesting books. He's diplomatic, but he tries to come up with sustainable solutions, and basically saying the new technology will wipe out a huge portion of work as we've known it, dramatically widening the wealth gap and posing a challenge to the human dignity of us all. So he doesn't seem to have any agenda. He doesn't seem to be political. He's just very matter of fact. And if you look into his book, for example, it gives some insight. And especially if you're a corporation or government, you probably want to check out his book, AI Superpowers. And then another quote that struck me, this unprecedented disruption requires no new scientific breakthroughs in AI, just the application of existing technology to new problems. It will hit many white-collar professionals just as hard as it hits blue-collar factory workers. So there he's talking about the kind of virtual automation that I'm talking about in addition to the physical side. And so it's real. Another quote, according to a 2017 study from PwC, AI's advances will generate almost 16 trillion of wealth. So it's great news for those with access to large amounts of capital and data. And that large data question is a very important point when you're thinking about a company. It's all about the data. It's what data you have. But Kai-Fu Lee is also saying it's very bad news for anyone who wants to earn their living doing soon to be replaced jobs. So, and people have different philosophies about this. And I would not say, I don't think anybody would say Kai-Fu Lee is an alarmist, like he's a major investor. He owns or is invested in companies that do AI, but he's just being realistic. And he says that jobs that will remain relatively insulated from AI fall on opposite ends of the income spectrum. CEOs, home care nurses, attorneys, hairstylists are all in safe professions. That the people in some of these professions will be swimming in the riches of the AI revolution, while others compete against a vast pool of desperate fellow workers. So I wouldn't say that I based my viewpoint on Kai-Fu Lee's, but I think it's informed by the data. And this is partly why I suggest the stages, like the first, second, and third stages that we'll be talking about. And I also don't necessarily agree with everything that Kai-Fu Lee says, but he has some very interesting things to say. And one of the things that was kind of astonishing, I met him, saw him speak, and he is a cancer survivor, so he's definitely attuned to the value of healthcare, providers, and so on. And what's interesting is he's so far beyond a lot of the discussion, at least in the United States, the debate about jobs being replaced or not. He just assumes they will, but it's based on data. And basically what he says is he thinks one of the things we should do is create more jobs in caregiving. And if you look at demographics in countries, including the United States, there is that need as populations age. But it's a very interesting perspective, because it's not even saying, create more jobs with AI like I'm advocating, but he's just all the way at the point of saying jobs that require human empathy, it'll be a long time. And he doesn't say it like that. He says empathy will not really be duplicated by robots or whatever, but very interesting perspective. And I think that is worth considering. So I'm trying to make this presentation for different audiences, individual, governments, corporations, but I'm also a professor, so I think it impacts education, and in a corporation or government, the training aspect. And basically where the job market goes, there the people will go eventually. So if you're in a position to influence training, like reskilling your workers, or you're in a school and any age, this is worth thinking about. And as you learn more about it, especially if you're new to it, what is commonly termed AI is very directly related to data science. You might see the acronym ML, which is machine learning. And then in some ways, the current stage of what is being applied in most ways is basically analytics. So there's AI being applied to vision recognition and so on. But a lot of what's happening, especially in the virtual automation, is you have a bunch of data, you look for patterns in it, and then machine learning offers a vastly more sophisticated way than we used to have to make predictions. So there are limits, but the huge advances that got my attention in what is called deep learning and neural networks happened not too long ago, and they led to very, very powerful increases in performance in various sectors. And one of the most notable ones that I remember was Google Translate, where they already had advanced translation of languages and have been known, compared to other computer translation programs, it's always been very powerful, but there are limits. There's context, jargon, slang, whatever. And if you compare human translation to computer translation, human has always been better. But what happened is they started kind of internally, secretly applying deep learning neural networks to their Google translation, and they didn't publicly announce it, but people started recognizing that there was a huge increase in the sophistication and the clarity and quality of the translation. And eventually they said, yeah, we've been doing this deep learning stuff. And then of course, Google has dived very deeply into AI and is a leader in it, and bought companies and hired academics and so on. So, but there is an aspect of it where a lot of, including the marketing thing, Google's a marketing company and they go beyond that. But basically a lot of, one way to think about AI is just that it's data hungry. That's an important point. And that data science before there was deep learning and, what you would call machine learning, which basically is interchangeable with AI, a lot of the principles in data science apply to machine learning. And then, well, it's early stage in some ways. Some of the machine learning stuff, there's a tool called TensorFlow, and a lot of machine learning is done in what you call the command line environment. So there's not necessarily a lot of evolved programs. The parallel would be, if you look back in history at the first programs for making a web page, you would just type code in make it and save it in a text file. And then they created visual interfaces to help manage it and so on. And there's always a debate, like, do you do it manually at the command line by typing text in, or do you have some program? But you're starting to see platforms. One is Data Robot, which is interesting, where it's kind of designed for applied AI, where the platform is basically saying, okay, you don't necessarily have to be a computer science engineer to do this. And that's one way of pursuing what I'd call the adopt stage, which we'll take a look at. But basically, in terms of training education, one way to jump into it is by using a platform that doesn't require you to know everything that a computer scientist might want to know. So you can, in training, look at AI platforms. They're starting to be introduced for different sectors. Take a look at Data Robot. That's an example of one. You can assign articles, books, and courses, and encourage every employee, citizen, and student to learn more. And when I'm talking about citizens, there's already countries who are doing that. So if anybody, let's see, is from Finland, shout out to you. I believe there's a national program in Finland, which makes a lot of sense to me, to encourage every citizen to learn as much as possible about AI. So there's debate about that too. Kai-Fu Lee is interesting. When we were talking after his presentation, I was just kind of asking him a couple questions, and I did an interview with him, which is also something I can give you if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn. But we're talking about jobs, and one of the things that came up, and it was actually based on a good blog post that Data Robot did. And Data Robot was talking about data, like the different kinds of professional positions in light of AI that you can pursue or that a company might need. So you'd have data engineer, data analyst, and machine learning engineer. And basically there's it's kind of a tier. Like a data analyst is sort of the beginning level. A data engineer might work in gathering all the data together that's in all these different databases. And then the data scientist or machine learning engineer might be the most sophisticated kind of position. So the discussion was, which of these jobs is safe itself? Because basically the implication of AI is it's going to increase in sophistication and ultimately eventually be able to do just about anything. And already there's such a talent drain in AI that if you look into it, a thing called auto ML and something like Data Robot, there's such a need for talent in AI that it's driven companies like Google to create machine learning, which does machine learning. So like assisting in theory the human people who do it, but it's so sophisticated. I was talking to him and the question was, what jobs would be safe even if you pursue all this? So it felt a little bit surreal to even be discussing that, but I suggested that really a data engineer might be the safest, and he actually agreed with that because when you look at doing AI type tasks, I don't know the exact percentage, but 80 to 90% of it is just looking at your data to see whether it's viable for use with machine learning, and then putting it together and doing what's called normalizing it. And a lot of it is just connecting and working with the data before you even get into the analysis of it. So that's why data engineering, potentially maybe as a company, if you're thinking about starting one, or as a skill, that would be a little bit harder to automate because there's so much data out there and the need to interact with people and so on. So it's just something to reinforce the idea that no job is 100% automation proof. And that's one of those trajectories that leads me to say, well, I'm not sure whether we can just assume that more jobs are going to be created. But in terms of training and education, one of the reasons why I'm saying AI platforms can be introduced is because it's a little bit easier to start with an interface that doesn't require you to have a computer science degree to work. So that's why something like Data Robot might be good. And then, just learn everything you can. And then, to learn more, Surfing the Tsunami as a book is just an introduction, but it talks about some of these issues. Connect with me on LinkedIn. There may be a link with this virtual AI summit where you can just download a free copy. And but if you're interested in the more updated data or the interview with Kai-Fu Lee, connect with me on LinkedIn. And if they don't have a link on AI Summit, just connect with me on LinkedIn. I can send you a copy. Invite your employees, colleagues, constituents, students to read. And I can also make custom versions for a country, government, region, company, whatever. So I'm open to collaboration. So what can we do? And this is where we get into the adapt, adopt, and adept. So, and this is on the individual level. So I invite you, if you're wondering what to do about the AI revolution, to pursue it in 3 stages. So if all you did was to learn more and pay attention and keep aware of things, keep aware of where things are headed, that's good. But it's better to adopt AI-related tools and platforms like some of the ones I mentioned, like Data Robot. Don't necessarily need to be a computer science person, but and this is something I tell my students, like realistically, it may be better for you to be involved managing AI than to be replaced in a position where you don't even have the familiarity to adopt the platform. It's a tricky ethical question, like should you encourage the adoption of a platform that automates tasks? I don't presume to know the answer for anybody, but I just see a certain amount of it is inevitable. And then the optimist would say, we're just trying to augment things. But I think there's economic reason to say, and there's data, like I mentioned before, that there are jobs that are being replaced in total. But there are companies who are reskilling and trying to help people learn things. So this is kind of the second stage for the individual adopt. And then adept, I guess, is the best. So and this was another thing that I discussed with Kai-Fu Lee and as part of the debate. So there are people who are programmers or in AI or whatever who say it's not realistic for everybody to learn it. And I don't agree. I don't necessarily think everybody on the planet could learn, but I think the more you're familiar with data, the better. And when I was talking to Kai-Fu Lee about it, and I think we were talking about China, but also America, and we were talking about coding, but also AI, like I don't think that he thinks everybody should learn coding or AI necessarily, but he said an interesting thing. The reason why that would actually be good is because then you're more likely to, if all your institutions, your schools, your governments, corporations are all pursuing it. And China is doing this. Like there are many countries, especially China, are aggressively pursuing AI education. Finland is another example. When you do that and you cast the net wide, even if everybody can't necessarily, be an AI engineer or whatever, then you're more likely to find people who percolate up through the system. And I think he used the word Bill Gates, like you're more likely to find the Bill Gates who can innovate and maybe create some new things that do create jobs. So I think he kind of accepted that as we were discussing that. So another thing I want to point out in terms of developing expertise or getting directly involved is you don't necessarily have to be an engineer. So one way I describe this is electricians versus engineers, and it's used sometimes in coding. Like when you learn programming, you can look at how there are engineers in normal industry and electricians. So electricians are not necessarily as sophisticated, don't have as much education, but there's a lot of employment available by doing electrical work in homes, corporations, or whatever. So there's a widespread demand for that skill. So you're an electrician, even though you're not necessarily an electrical engineer. And there's a certain parallel in coding where you might have experience in the finance industry, for example, then you learn coding. And even though you don't have a computer science PhD, the expertise that you have in a certain field allows you to work with data or code or whatever it is, and not necessarily be, a computer science major, computer scientist or whatever, but it's kind of like being the electrician versus the engineer. And I think as AI evolves, you'll see more of that. And to me, it kind of revolves around data. So for my business students, for example, I'd say, definitely encourage them to take coding, learn more about data and everything. But you don't necessarily have to feel like, even when I'm saying encouraging, develop as much expertise as you're willing to, there are things you can do along the way, I guess, is what I'm saying. So it's more aspirational, but I think all 3 of these levels are good. In terms of institutions, so like, and I'm kind of speaking to governments or nonprofits or whatever, and in this case, same kind of good, better, best, 3 stages. That as an institution or country or society, encouraging people to learn more and paying attention, looking at the implications. It also includes ethics, and we'll get into that a little bit because there's a lot of mistrust of governments and corporations, especially in terms of how data is handled. And then the adopt stage, So you can go beyond just adapting, go beyond just waiting and see, because it's going to impact economies. It already is. But I would definitely say adopt related tools and platforms. And in this case, explore the ethics and implications of the economic and market forces around AI and how it impacts people. So not just how it impacts the economy and creating jobs, but also the job replacement. And then also really listening to the grassroots about their perspectives on privacy. So one of the things about AI is, for example, when you look into deep learning, neural networks or whatever, there's a lot of decisions that are made when you analyze people, but you can't necessarily explain why the decision was made. And that's a problem because there can be bias that creeps in. And then there's a privacy issue as well. So I would just say, look at the implications. And then in terms of aiming for the top as a society, as a government, I think that any government or society anywhere in the world can get directly involved with developing AI. And I think there's reason to believe with some of the research that Glia Foundation is doing that I'll mention in a few slides, that there really is grassroots opportunity. And some of it may be taking that perspective instead of just being an engineer in Silicon Valley, even though I'm thankful for many things that have been developed. They're not necessarily omniscient, and there are cultural perspectives and innovations and things that come from diverse perspectives. And that's always been true of innovation ecosystems. Like some of the greatest innovations have been when people from different disciplines contribute and come up with something new. So really, all around the world, any culture can make a good contribution. And it's not like a utopian ideal, it's just a reality based on innovation ecosystems. So yeah, I'd say get directly involved with developing AI, harnessing its power for good, and participating in its future direction. That last point is important. So governments, societies, people can passively allow AI to be developed solely by companies like the ones in Silicon Valley or other countries. But to the extent that there's more widespread and grassroots participation, then there's more of a chance to participate. And just a note, that's partly why Elon Musk created OpenAI, even though it's kind of taken a different direction now. The reason why he was doing that is just so he could keep tabs on some of the technology. And so he's not directly involved on a day-to-day basis, but his concern is a little bit more down the road with human level consciousness and AI and just its power. So he had some concerns, but it's just an example of getting involved to have an impact on the future direction. In terms of corporations, originally I was going to base the whole presentation around this, but I just wanted to kind of relate it to different audiences. So I think there is a big opportunity for companies, and it's not just about necessarily reducing the time it takes to do tasks, but just innovatively using the data that you have to do new things. And from a competitive standpoint, small, medium, or large, really good idea to be aware of where things are headed, including creating new companies. And I'm keenly interested in seeing new business models arise, new companies arise, because that's the only way that, in theory, an optimist would be able to see that new jobs come out, is by people like yourself who are listening to this presentation by starting companies, whether it's local or something completely new. And a good source of inspiration that I just want to say, I don't have a slide on it, but I'd recommend reading the book Master Algorithm. That gives a really good idea of some of the potential, and it's a little more positive. I mean, it has some different perspectives, but it's a really good book, Master Algorithm by Pedro Domingos. And that, whenever I read that, I get inspired by that. And it includes talking about some of the major advances and wonderful things, truly wonderful things that AI can do in things like healthcare. For example, in the middle of COVID, not only has AI been used, but also quantum chemistry and quantum computing to a certain extent to help develop the vaccines. Like, and AI is being used all over the place, but it's really going to make a difference in people's lives throughout the planet. So healthcare is an exciting thing. That's on the one hand, but on the other, you have to make sure that the data is treated in a way that people feel really comfortable. So, there's back and forth. So as a company, what I'd say is same thing, learn more, pay attention, keep aware of where things are headed. Same as a government or individual, I'd encourage any company to explore adopting AI-related tools and platforms. And also, there's kind of a rush toward it but you can fall into the trap of any number of companies will say, yeah, any company can use AI, but you do have to base that on actually looking at an application. So one thing you can do is look at how AI is used by other companies in your industry. And then an important thing is you have to figure out whether the data you have can be suitably used by it, because not all data can necessarily be used for predictive analysis or machine learning or whatever. And then the most important thing really is to look at effective use cases. I'd also apply that to an individual learner. Like one thing that slowed me down initially when I was learning about AI was basically the approach of traditional computer science, where the ideal approach is you learn just about every tool because you don't know which one you're going to use. You learn all the different kinds of math, all the different techniques, and without necessarily learning context or use cases in business. And that's actually a blind spot. In some cases, you'd have machine learning engineers going into corporations who do not have business experience. And that's why I think applied AI is important, including having business professionals learn more about AI, even if they're not actively engaged in it, because it's important to know what the effective use cases are. So it's something where business can help computer science learn, and vice versa. And I believe in that kind of collaboration. But use cases are kind of where, even as an individual learner, that helped me to learn, because instead of just this abstract collection of linear algebra, statistics, probability, and all these different programs and tools, instead of just being faced with that, like if you start looking at massively online courses and different things, a lot of them have prerequisites that are fairly deep. So a computer science major might have that math, but do my students necessarily have that math? I don't know. So do you necessarily need all of that? So in the first version of Surfing the Tsunami in the book, I kind of just assumed, okay, well, I wasn't really sure, but learn as much as you can. So I still think that's valid, but one more efficient way to use it, especially if you're talking about learning context, which is very important, is to look at use cases. So if you're learning AI as an individual or a corporation, learning the context in which it's effectively used helps you to see, data science processes or tools or whatever that are applied, rather than necessarily having the full tool set. And what I'd say is you could still learn, all the options and tools and so on, but you could add value sooner than you might think. So, and then at a corporate level, I'd say even if you started a company that did it, or IBM is a good example of a company that was doing one thing and pivoted to services in another. They had hardware, that was their business model, and then they basically pivoted to consulting. So I think there's some companies out there who might be able to do that, but you can create new companies. And I'd say again, like, start out by being aware, adapting, keeping your eyes open, adopt platforms when you can, and then seek to become adept, even if it means you're pivoting your company. Because if once you start looking at how some company, like any industry you're in, basically, there's probably some company out there who is automating some aspect of it, and it will be more and more difficult to be competitive over time if you're not using AI and automation. Like that's kind of the bottom line. So if you're interested more in that in a corporate sense, or especially a startup sense, there's a very interesting venture capital company called BeePartners.vc, BeePartners.vc, and they have a position paper called Machines Will Win, which is very interesting. It's kind of Optimist, pro automation or whatever, but I didn't really see anything I disagreed with it. So it kind of shows opportunities and something that they call deep tech. So if you're interested in kind of the startup side and some new areas where automation AI are being deployed, check out BeePartners.vc and look for their Machines Will Win paper, as well as some of their blog posts. They've got some interesting stuff. So when I was talking a few slides ago about some of the ethics and questions, for individuals too, this affects everybody and their data, and also corporations. I'm doing some research for Glia.net. So this section of the presentation is on behalf of the Glia Foundation. And you can look up Richard Whitt on Google. He was a legal counsel at Google, currently works with Mozilla, and basically he started exploring some of the implications in terms of data policy. So basically in marketing, there's a terms of service. You might, click OK on any number of terms of service when you start a social network or whatever, but people don't necessarily understand what's being done with the data. But one main and important thing to understand about data is the reason why a company like Facebook or Google is making so much money is because of the value of the data. And part of the ethical question is, are people really being fairly compensated? And in terms of privacy, if you start looking at all the marketing companies who connect data, there's probably a profile about you that's deeper and more detailed than you possibly imagine. Among other things, companies scrape the web and there might be a piece of data here and they gather it and match it to another piece of data there. And then AI just has increased this. So one of the things that Glia is doing is looking at sensible ways to have balance. So it's not against companies. It's looking at how might a company redevelop trust. So if you look at things like Accenture Vision 2020, like the whole global corporate world knows that trust is an issue, not just with governments, but corporations. How do you rebuild trust? And that's one of the things that Glia Foundation is looking at in the context of AI and data. So new areas, so for institutions, corporations, even individuals, would be to help build, sorry for the typo there, new areas for institutions and corporations to help build trust, protect privacy, and empower users. So these are some of the new areas. And I also think there's some business models there. So if you're a government or you're thinking about a new business area, some of these ethics issues, I think there's a new industry sector and some various kinds of companies that can be created because there's a massive need for this. And so I think there are opportunities here. And digital fiduciaries is one of the areas that Glia is looking at. So you can look at the articles. There's a link there, whitt.media, medium.com. And if you look up Richard Whitt on LinkedIn, he posts some of the articles there. But basically, digital fiduciaries, for example, if you look at the power of AI that's deployed by a company or government, and then you think of the user, users have nothing. Like there's no personal AI that helps to serve as a check and balance against institutional AI. And so some people would say, well, you don't need any check and balance, but that assumes 100% trust that all of your wishes are being followed in terms of privacy. And it also touches on that question, like, are you really being fairly compensated for your data? And under what conditions do you want your data used? And people there is a significant amount of mistrust among a great many people. So digital fiduciaries is an idea, potentially developing a certification to help empower users, but also for corporations reduce legal exposure. Like if you look at the headlines, CEOs, many countries around the world, Europe, the United States, it just makes sense. Like instead of being called up and being in the hot seat, proactively working on ways of rebuilding trust, like connecting to systems. So you have institutional AI, but you also have a personal AI that empowers users connecting to your corporate AI, and then there's a little bit more balance. So you can look into it. It's hard to encapsulate in a moment, but take a look at an article series that we're developing that mentions some of these things. And one thing I would say is that there's also business opportunity here. And for a corporation, what I'd say is that the more leadership that's shown, the more trust and loyalty you would have from customers if you take the lead on some of these things rather than being regulated into it. So the regulation may never come, but it's it's kind of hard to say. And personal AI is kind of similar, like just the concept of and they're kind of blended, but just think of a digital advocate with all the complexity of data, privacy, security, and all that. The article series gets into it, including the legal basis, the precedents, and something called fiduciary principles, where like a doctor or lawyer has a duty of care to the individual, but does a corporation? Not necessarily. Then the whole article series is written in the context of COVID, so it also discusses health data trusts. And there's some areas around health data and the age of COVID and just data trust that are interesting. So there's a lot of opportunity, and it's just a good idea for governments, institutions, corporations to look at some of these areas. And whitt.medium.com has some of the articles which may be thought-provoking. So last but not least, next steps, if you're interested in continuing the conversation or collaborating or want a free copy of the book for yourself or your company or country or organization or whatever, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Just look for Todd Kelsey, Toddkelsey. I think my profile image has a TEDx image, and then there's this link there. And if you connect with me on LinkedIn, I could also send you a copy of this presentation if you like. I'm open to collaboration. I'm a professor. I've got students, including figuring out how to create new jobs. I think that's hugely important, new companies, new educational materials. And then I'm also open to feedback and suggestions. Like if you have found something, some data that you think is compelling reason to be an optimist, I'd love to hear that. You can also look at Tsunami.ai. I'm not sure if it works without the www, but that has a little bit more information on the book. And then I just say, in return for feedback, I can make the book available free to individuals, institutions, companies, communities, or entire countries. And I'm also interested in trying to get it translated. It's not perfect, but it's a good introduction and it touches on some of these issues. And then I'd also reiterate, if you're interested in some of these issues, including some emerging opportunities, we just completed an article series, 6 articles, in partnership with the Glia Foundation, and some of it in Article 7, we're going to do a final article. We finished the main articles, but we're going to be doing proposing some businesses and projects. And regardless of whether you're an individual, have no prior experience, or you're an advanced AI company, we're looking for collaboration between government, people, organizations, privacy organizations, or whatever. And if you just go to whitt.medium.com, you can see some of those articles. The 7th article is going to be out sometime in December, so maybe after the AI Summit or sometime around there, and that'll have specific proposals for dealing with some of these issues, and including, which I think is one of the most important things, is finding new ways to create jobs. So keep an eye out for that. And there's also some nice comic art and some fictional narrative in there. So we were trying to be a little bit experimental. So with that, wanted to thank you for taking a look, making it all the way to the end of this presentation. And I look forward to hearing from you on LinkedIn.